Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started on our presentation today with Jennifer Kushner. Did last month. If you have any questions, please email me. I'll be monitoring my email account throughout the presentation, and then I will ask the questions that are emailed at the end. And if you're here in person, feel free to ask in advance or during the presentation. We actually have some worksheets here if you want to take them. So my email is nicole.wykowski, wykowski@uwex.edu. And if you are on the WISP line, feel free at the end to unmute the line and you can ask questions then too. So without further ado, Jennifer Kushner is here today. She's going to be discussing developing a strong evaluation plan. She is an evaluation specialist with Cooperative Extension, where she has been here for 10 years. But she has been doing evaluation work for the last 30 years. And during that time, she's been involved in lots of grant work. I think she's been in 20 to 25 significant grants or contracts throughout her career. And they've been a mix of federal, nonprofit, and different partnership types. She has served on lots of review panels and consults with organizations around the evaluation component of requests for applications. So Jennifer, if you would like to take it away.
Thank you, Nikki. All right, good morning, everybody. I'm gonna get used to this technology here. I'm really delighted to be here. I think the Grant Hub is just a fabulous new asset to the organization, and I'm just really pleased for the opportunity to be able to have some conversation around how to put together a strong grant proposal. I'm aware that those of you listening are across the different divisions and different entities, and that some of you may be veterans in terms of putting together grant proposals and evaluation plans, and some of you may be just starting out. So I've tried to sort of bridge the how to get started with maybe a little more nuance for those of you that have been doing this for a while. As Nikki said, we'll take questions at the end. If you have some burning, pressing question that comes up in the meantime, and you don't think you can hold on to it, feel free to send Nikki an email and we'll try to address it during the course of the time. And let's see here.
Oh, is it doing it again?
Let's try this. We're getting this figured out here. Hang on one sec.
Want me to pull it up again?
Yeah.
Okay, should just be right click. No?
You've got the magic touch.
Or left click. Sorry, maybe I'm telling you the wrong thing. There you go. Left.
Okay.
Oh, too far.
Let's go back.
You got to go to previous.
Yeah. All right, there we go. All right. So the focus of the session is really on evaluation planning. We may creep a little bit into evaluation implementation just because there's sort of a little bit of a bridge there. And I believe you should have received, there's a guide that we'll be using kind of throughout the session that you can follow along with, and there's some additional materials in there for use afterward. So wanted to get started with really sort of what I would describe as pre-work. And it has to do with understanding the lay of the land or understanding the context before you get started. The piece that I can't emphasize enough is read the request for proposals of the RFA. Each funder, foundation, et cetera, is going to have its own particular components of a proposal and an evaluation plan. You really need to understand specifically what they're looking for. The second thing I would recommend is really to try to get to know the funder ahead of time. There are a lot of different ways to do this, but get familiar with proposals that have been successful. If you know somebody who's submitted a successful proposal to that funder, spend time talking with them, talk with other investigators. one of the ways that I've found over the years to really develop a deep understanding of how things happen once you submit is to try to get yourself on a review panel that really gives you an in-depth experiential sort of opportunity to understand what the discussions are, how criteria are applied, the wild differences in quality in proposals that come in. So look for those kinds of opportunities or make yourself available for them. And the last piece that I would really emphasize is know your internal collaborators. What I mean by that is know who inside your institution really needs to be involved. What do they do? What are their roles? Within cooperative extension and some of the other divisions, there'll be a pre-award team and a post-award team. So really get to know who those people are, what they're looking for, what their timelines are. And for those of you that are new to grant writing, I would really recommend spending time on this before you're in process of trying to submit a proposal. So I call it pre-work really because if you're anticipating a call for proposals coming out in May, spend time now really getting to know the people and understand what their needs are and what their timelines and expectations are, and everything will just go a lot more smoothly. Oops, thank you. Yeah. All right, I want to talk through typical expectations of an evaluation plan within a proposal. Really, the most important thing is that you, like I said, follow the expectations of the particular funder that you're submitting a proposal to. So there's some nuances, there are different kinds of elements that they'll be looking for, different language. But what I'll share with you now are just sort of general, these are things that are typically asked for in some form or another. So the first one is a description of how stakeholders will be involved. Stakeholders are basically everyone that has a stake in your effort or in your project. Really spend time on this. Don't drive by it. Know who they are, how and when you'll engage them, not just how that will happen in the context of the work of the proposal, but in the context of evaluation. Public institutions like state and federal agencies often are mandated to be accountable for this. So they're accountable to various bodies to talk about how have they engaged the public, and therefore how do the things that they fund engage the public. So it's really important to provide a clear description of how stakeholders will be involved, and we'll get into this in a little more detail when we talk about the actual elements of the plan. Have a really clearly articulated purpose. And again, we'll talk about this in some more detail, but for most grant proposals, there are a lot of different purposes for conducting an evaluation. Most funders are going to be interested in outcome or impact purposes for your evaluation. That's not to say that you might not also include process or developmental types of evaluation activities, but you're going to want to be really clear about the purpose of reporting back to them how you've used their money effectively. Appropriate choice of methods, and again, we'll get into this in more detail, but virtually all funders are going to ask you to explain not just what your methods are, but why you selected the method. So not just we're conducting a survey of everyone in the state, but why are we doing that? So it's a choice of method and an explanation of method. I think another piece related to going back to purpose is that increasingly the accountability expectations are becoming tighter, if you will. I think even if your funder is not explicitly asking for an outcome or impact kind of purpose for evaluation, you want to make sure to include it. I think that's really important. How data will be managed really has to do with not just how human participants or human subjects will be supported or addressed, but all aspects of data management. Okay. Logic modeling or log frames. These are visual graphic tools that depict the relationship of your programmatic effort to the evaluation effort. Some funders actually require a logic model, and we'll have some examples through the course of the time here so you can see what those look like. Log frame is another typical format for some kinds of funders. We have a lot of resources in PD&E, in Cooperative Extension on logic modeling, and I'll get, toward the end, I'll get you some links for those resources. Appropriate expertise. This is really important, and I've probably learned the most about this from being on panels, review panels. A really big mistake is to make the biological or physical scientist your evaluator unless that person has social science and or evaluation expertise. So reviewers and funders are going to be looking for, do you have a team or a person who is conducting and leading the evaluation that actually has the appropriate expertise in evaluation type methods? So it may be somebody who doesn't have the title of evaluator. It could be somebody who's got a strong, perhaps, economic methods, social science expertise, but they're going to be looking for not just, do you have a warm body that's got evaluation dollars on that body, but really the expertise needed to conduct the evaluation effectively. And this is a place where people really get fairly tripped up. Appropriate budget. I would say this is a little bit contested terrain, but the tendency is to short shift this. You may or may not be, if you're thinking of putting together an evaluation plan as part of an overall proposal, you may not be in a position to influence the overall proposal budget. But I think you are in a position to say, here's what I think the evaluation is appropriately going to need to be carried out effectively. Some funders are moving toward or have moved toward parameters for the budget. So for example, NSF for years has required 10 to 12% of the budget in some of their award areas be designated for evaluation. I know USDA is having those conversations in some places, NIH as well, I'm talking federal agencies now. And this goes back to the pre-work in terms of really understanding your funder and looking at the kinds of proposals that have been successful and what did their evaluation budget allocations look like. And there are resources to help think this through. But I guess the case I would make for this, aside from being competitive, is that evaluation is really what helps you make the case to continue continue funding or to scale your effort. So, for example, you might start with a pilot project. What's going to enable you to pursue additional funds to fully develop that pilot or scale an effort that you've got at one locality to a larger locality is the evidence that you're able to create to make a case for yourself. So that's all the evaluation piece. And if your effort is not just a one-off situation, this is really something to give some attention to. And timeline evaluation really needs to start of the project, and it will talk about baseline evaluation, but in essence, if you're making a case, you want to know what you're starting with. And so you want to clearly, in your plan, talk about where in the course of the overall project are those evaluation activities happening. Okay, this is sort of a simplistic picture. I want to take a moment to discuss evaluation in relation to the overall project. So we're focused on evaluation plans, but an evaluation plan actually needs to be deeply coupled with the rest of the project. And so program development or project development and evaluation actually need to be intimately coupled. This sort of simple barbell graphic is basically an illustration of how these two things come together. So what's your effort? Your effort is what you're doing programmatically or within the project to bring about the change that you're proposing to bring about through your funded effort. And the effect is what you hope is going to happen as a result of your effort, right? So you're doing activities and you're investing in people and a variety of things in order to bring about some change, which is your effect. And we're doing these things because we think that there's a case to be made for the need for that effect. In essence, this is like a simple diagram of a theory of change, which is sort of a big term. If you're not familiar with it, is basically what your project proposal is. Your project proposal is you're making a case for a funder to invest in a bunch of people and activities in order to bring about a change. And there's some logic or rationale behind what you're proposing to them. And evaluation and the evaluation plan is basically a way to measure and describe the effectiveness of your theory of change. So move us forward, just another sort of simple diagram here. You're starting with an understanding of an issue, a situation, some opportunity that you want to address. That's the context. Just want you to pay attention to the big boxes here. And that issue, maybe the water in the central sands in Wisconsin is drying up. You're going to do some things to try to bring about increased in citizen awareness of drilling and water well usage, because you think that that's going to have some sort of effect in how people make choices in what they're doing. Part of what you're doing in an evaluation plan, and this gets a little bit into evaluation, is in the plan you want to be able to talk about the relationships between the effort and the effect. And we'll get to this when we talk about evaluation questions, but are your co-investigators, the people putting together the proposal, making a case that the effort causes the effect, is contributive to the effect, is catalytic to the effect? The relationship between what your co-investigators are proposing for the effort and what the change is actually important, because it informs how you design your evaluation. And you need to describe that in your evaluation plan in the proposal, not in excruciating detail, but in some detail. So if your effort you think is just going to serve as a sort of a catalyst for some sort of effect, your evaluation is going to want to talk about how you will measure or describe that. All right, so we're going to move to a sort of a simple tool here for evaluation planning. And what I would say is the steps that are in this plan are really kind of going back to what I said in the beginning. I think if you address all of these pieces, you've got the kind of core components that you need for your evaluation plan for your proposal. Again, you're going to want to look at what your funder is looking for in the format and the language, but these sort of elements or components are pretty typical. And for those of you that have just joined here in the room, feel free to take a guide if you don't have one with you. All right, so one thing that we're going to talk about both for planning and for implementation of evaluation is that throughout the process of an evaluation, you want to be managing the evaluation. In your plan, within your proposal, you need to describe how you plan to manage the evaluation. Now, this might be, depending on the guidelines within the RFA, a subsection within the area where they request a description of the evaluation approach, or it may be in a different part of the proposal where they ask you to describe the overall management of the project. So you really need to pay attention to, again, when you're reading the RFA, don't just read the piece about evaluation. You really need to read through all the pieces. If basically a team submitting a proposal needs to talk to how evaluation is going to be managed. So you're going to need to make sure you put that in the right place. So here are some best practices. And some of these I'm repeating because they're really important. Make sure you've got the right expertise. And that expertise is both in terms of leading the effort and implementing the effort. In some cases, that might be one person who's both leading and implementing, or it might be a team of people. Appropriate budget, again, you're going to want to make sure that you're have allocated the appropriate funds and that you're monitoring your expenditures for the evaluation in accordance with what the evaluation activities are that need to happen. For example, let's say you've got a 5-year award and you've got evaluation activities in the first year, which are baseline activities, trying to get, it's kind of the current status of what you're starting with. You've got a 2.5-year midpoint evaluation, and then you've got an end of project 5-year evaluation. Years 1, 3, and 5 are heavy in workload. And so you want to make sure your budget lines up with what the actual activities are. Evaluation roles, it's important to, in the plan, to describe not just the role that the evaluator or evaluation team plays on the overall project management team, but also whether they're internal evaluators or external evaluators. So let me explain that. In some cases, funders are looking for what they'll call third-party or external evaluators. Those are people that are outside the core project team that are perceived to have a more objective or neutral stance on the activities. Many funders don't specify whether they're looking for internal or external. An internal evaluator or evaluation team would be people that are currently involved in other aspects of the project and maybe within the organization. So it's important to articulate that. If it's not clear in your plan or in your proposal, sometimes questions can be raised during the review process. Data management and human subjects. Human subjects or human participants, it has to do with how we treat the people that are involved in our evaluation activities. There are a bunch of national standards and institutional standards around protections and processes that we need to use, and you'll want to describe that in terms of management of the evaluation. And then again, data management is just, where's data going to be stored, who's going to have access, what's the infrastructure, if you've got a distributed team geographically, how is that going to work? Developing a monitoring plan. Again, so let's go back to the example of a 5-year proposal where we've got heavy evaluation activities in years 1, 3, and 5. You might want to describe, I would encourage you to describe if there's anything going on in years 2 and 4, maybe just a touch point, not a comprehensive data collection set of activities, but just sort of maybe a touch point kind of monitoring. Another best practice is really to have the evaluator or evaluation team at the table right from the start. So as the proposal is being put together, make sure that you or the evaluators are alongside with the other co-investigators, kind of thinking through what evaluation activities need to be happening at what points in time, and make sure to include baseline. All right, so step 1, that we're going now to that 5-step guide, engaging stakeholders. This is really something that you'll want to be doing throughout the evaluation, but in terms of writing up the plan, you can just provide well, it depends on the guidelines, but most often you can just provide a brief description of the ways in which you intend to engage stakeholders in determining it could be around determining the evaluation questions. It could be in data collection. It could be in sharing results. But you really need to think about these kind of core questions here. So who are the stakeholders in your evaluation? And that's related to who are the stakeholders of the project. How can they be involved? What roles might they have? Are there ways that you can think of to get them involved? All of this should be described, if you can, within the proposal. And there's always sort of an art, if you will, to most proposals have word limits. So you need to really focus on being concise and distill your ideas to kind of the core. Here are the core activities. Here's who we're trying to reach, and do that within the appropriate word count space that you've got for the evaluation. So a couple thoughts about why engaging stakeholders is important. You don't need to put this in your plan. It's just sort of informational. First of all, it increases the chances that your evaluation is going to be used and useful. It adds street cred or validity to the actual evaluation activities themselves. It can help with clarifying roles and responsibilities. It can be a vehicle to enhance the cultural relevancy and competency of the overall effort of the project. And it helps protect human subjects if you understand who they are and what their needs are. It can help avoid real and perceived conflicts of interest, and it helps share power. So again, if you're doing a community-based kind of project or effort, that's really particularly important. All right, step 2, focus the evaluation. And I mentioned this before, purposes for evaluation really vary a lot. For grants and contracts, you will want to speak to outcomes and impact. So what is the actual effect that the project is having on the people or environment that it was intended to have an effect on? You might also want to speak to how you are going to systematically use data or feedback to improve the effort. So that's more about process evaluation. And we'll look at a couple examples here in a second. Here are some of the kinds of questions that might help you in thinking about the focus and purpose of your evaluation. It's important to really get clear on this. Many people just sort of jump right to methods. You know, we're going to conduct a survey without really spending time articulating the purpose and the questions and what you want to know in terms of the evaluation. The reason this is important is it drives the approach. Your purpose drives the kind of methods that you actually end up employing. And so rather than jumping right to what are the tools or what are the methods we're using, you really want to kind of take a step back and think about what are we going to do with this information? What's the purpose? You know, what are the kinds of questions that we're seeking to answer? So many of you might be familiar with a logic model. Again, this is a visual graphic tool that is very popular with a lot of funders. It's basically the top half of this picture. So for the moment, just set the yellow on the bottom aside. So a logic model is a depiction of the programmatic effort, including the investments you're making and the outcomes or kinds of change you're trying to bring about as a result of the effort. There are different types of evaluation that can kind of tend to correlate with different parts of a program cycle, if you will. So many of you have heard the term needs assessment. A needs assessment could be like a baseline evaluation activity. So now looking at the bottom, the yellow, that's a particular purpose, right? So a purpose for evaluation is we want to understand the core perspectives and attitudes around this issue in the community, and that's going to be our baseline. So you'll describe that particular method grounded in your approach, your purpose. Outcomes and impact, you can see, are sort of after you've done some implementation. And we can make these slides available after day 2, so you can look at these a little more closely. I'll give you a minute just to kind of look at this, because there's a lot of words on this page. All right. Again, a lot of funders are going to ask you to talk about if your evaluation includes an outcomes or impact focused evaluation, how your evaluation activities will measure or describe short, medium, and or long-term kinds of outcomes. Use this slide loosely because sometimes changes in behavior, for example, may not come about as a result of an increase in understanding of an issue. Changes in behavior can come about because of policy changes too. But in essence, what you're going to want to describe is, again, what are the specific effects or changes that you're trying to measure or describe? Are they changes in understanding? Are they skills and practices? Are they changes in actual physical conditions? And then how the particular methods are going to help you or help the evaluation team actually do that measurement. So again, your evaluation questions, we'll get to evaluation questions. Oops, sorry. Really are going to help guide your evaluation activity. So often in an evaluation plan within a proposal, you'll actually write in, here are our leading evaluation questions. Share an example. Next slide. Yeah. Actually, there's not example in just 1 minute. So just maybe an additional point. This is all related to purpose and evaluation questions. Clarify what your questions are within the plan. Make them specific, and I'll show you an example in a minute. Really focus on what do you need to know, or your team, in order to make a case, not everything under the sun that you'd like to know about the effort. You may choose to go ahead and evaluate a lot of different things, including a bunch of things you'd like to know. But for the purposes of your proposal, you're going to want to be really succinct, really focused. What do you absolutely have to measure or describe to make a case to your funder that that you're stewarding their money well, and that you're learning something new and or having the impact that you wanted to have. Prioritize, so you may do a brainstorming with your team around evaluation questions, and then really focus it down to just, no more than 5. You really don't want more than 5. I would say 3 or less guiding evaluation questions, meta questions. Go to an example. So I'm going to show you first, this is a logic model that's connected to one of my grants. Let's look at, I'll give you a minute to look at it. You can see in this logic model, it's a little unconventional the way this one is laid out. We've got our theory of change along the bottom. This is not typically part of a logic model, but we thought we would be explicit. We've got a bunch of interconnected aspects of our approach or effort. Let's look at the programmatic outcomes column. Improved water knowledge, improved metacognition, meaning improved capacity to think, and improved behaviors related to water engagement and caring. And we're basically saying, for the purposes of our evaluation, and we'll get to this, that's what we're going to focus on. Our guiding evaluation questions are going to focus on those outcomes. And we believe, and we can make a case that we think if those outcomes are fulfilled and manifested, it will lead to broader impacts in society. A comment about the use of the term impacts. That's a little bit of a contested term in the evaluation space. I would say the conventional knowledge or understanding is that impacts are longer term efforts. They're the result of cumulative outcomes being achieved that create change in the broader community or societal landscape. If you have a one-year grant, you are not going to be able to talk about programmatic or project impact. You're really going to want to focus on outcomes. If you have a 10-year, if you're building on an effort that's been underway for a long time and you're in year 10, you might start to think about evaluating for impact. So what you focus on has a lot to do with the duration of your effort and the amount of other related work that's going into supporting that change. I'm going to not get into that particular piece too much right now unless we have questions later. So you remember those 3 outcomes. Here are our key evaluation questions. Has our effort, macro and micro, and I'll come back to that, improved deep understanding of water? Has our effort, macro and micro, improved metacognition or ability to systems think? And if yes, have these led to improved engagement and caring? So I want to illustrate a couple points here. Well, first of all, let me talk about macro and micro. This particular grant has 5 core objectives, and it's got a lot of activities, and they're nationwide, and it's very distributed. Macro and micro has to do with at a kind of across all of our activities. This is macro. Across all of our activities, have we improved water? Micro is within specifically one of the initiatives, the National Fellows Program, for example, have we improved a deep understanding of water? The way that we make a case about the macro is that we take a look at the micro. We look at all the different specific programmatic efforts. Has the National Fellows Program improved understanding of water, deep understanding of water? Has the water school done that? And we look at all those in together to be able to help answer the question at a macro, large project scale, have we done that? The other thing that I want to emphasize here is that all of the terms or ideas in here have shared understanding on the team, or at least on the evaluation team. So if that team was in the room, we would all understand effort to be the same thing. Our effort are our 5 objectives. Our effort are those 5 implementation strategies of what we're doing. Our deep understanding of water, we have a shared mental model, if you will, of what that means. So we know we've already identified what are we looking for to help us understand if people who have touched the project's understanding is both deep and better. So we've worked that out. We know what we mean by metacognition, and we have a tool, an assessment tool that helps us measure it. So my point here is whatever your questions are, you want to spend some time making sure that everybody on your team or your evaluators or your evaluator knows how you're going to measure each one of those things and has a shared understanding of the meaning of those things. Okay, moving on, step 3 of the 5 steps, collecting information. So this, as I said before, most people kind of tend to jump right here. What are the methods? I'm going to just say it's really important to focus on managing stakeholder engagement and focusing both in your plan and also in your implementation before you get to talking about data collection. So questions you're going to want to respond to in your plan are using existing information, existing data, and or are you collecting new data? Both are completely typical and credible, but you want to articulate if you're using existing information, how you're going to access it, if it's protected material, how you're going to handle it or manage it. We have a variety of publications in PD&E to methods, and I'll share that. You can access them here, and I've got a link at the end as well. Just to talk through a couple, thank you, a couple common methods. So again, in your plan, there's gonna be a section on methods where you're going to describe your best shot at what methods you're thinking about using and why. In reality, most of us change our methods somewhat after the proposal, if it's funded, or the project gets underway. And I think most funders are fine with that. I mean, you basically, in the proposal, you're taking your best stab at what method you think is going to be most appropriate. Once you actually get into implementation, you may learn that there's no broadband in the communities you're trying to reach, and an online survey is not going to be effective. So you may change it. But you'll want to describe in the proposal or in the plan what you're thinking about. I'm not going to talk through all of these data collection methods. Again, we've got tools and resources in PD&E on the website that describe these in detail, and resources to help you. In terms of existing data, there's the population lab, survey data. There's a lot of data already out there, and that often gets overlooked, particularly at baseline. So I would encourage you to take a minute and sort of ask yourselves and your team, what do we already know? What's out there? What can we may need a little more analysis, but what can we already use that may reduce the overall burden on both staffing and budget? Another recommendation around method is to select a method that matches your level of understanding of the sort of the state of affairs. And I put this in here because depending on your disciplinary orientation, there's certain methods that are considered maybe standard practice or the gold standard, and they actually may not be the best or most appropriate method. So for example, I'm going to use like Diane Fossey as an example. Many of the great scientists actually started out with really simple observation. This is low tech, time intensive, but low tech. But that's a completely appropriate and actually preferred method when you don't have a deep understanding of the phenomenon that are in front of you. There's a tendency sometimes in certain disciplines to jump right to randomized control trial, which is resource intensive, requires certain kinds of expertise, stats, different kinds of analyses expertise, and actually may not be appropriate for what you're trying to understand and learn from your evaluation. So again, I won't go into a lot of detail on this right now, but how much do we already know, or the project team, the investigating team, how much do we already know about the phenomenon or issue? If it's pretty low, I would select a method that's sort of at the lower end of this method matching matrix, which is what this thing is, or consult with your evaluators and account for that appropriately in the expertise and budget part of your plan. And again, if you're in the 10th year and you know a lot, you may want to go to something more complex like a meta-analysis, but don't jump there right away. Culturally appropriate. This is another piece that funders increasingly are really paying attention to, not just in the evaluation aspect of the proposal, but the proposals overall. To what degree have you thought about cultural relevancy in your methods and implementation of that project? So I'll give you an example, another example from a project. We had proposed the idea of conducting mail surveys and questionnaires to understand, the phenomenon, or to understand the behaviors around water management on this particular project. The communities we were working with, first of all, elders drove the decision-making about what information got shared. Surveys were completely culturally inappropriate and ineffective, technologically ineffective mechanism to collect data. And we had to really regroup and ended up conducting talking circles that were led by elders in the community. So had we spent time trying to understand this before we put our proposal together, we would have designed our evaluation plan, methods, expertise, budget accordingly. But we had to sort of regroup and revisit that sort of mid-course. So I would encourage you to really think through who are you trying to engage in your evaluation, different aspects of culture or identity that you want to take into account in terms of your methods and your participation approaches. And with regard to data collection procedures, these are also pieces that your funder may ask you to speak to. So who are you engaging as your evaluation participants? Timelines, when will data be collected? Are you doing a sample? Describe how you're doing your sampling. Who's going to be doing the data collection and how will they be trained? So I was talking with a colleague recently who was hoping to have youth and volunteers collect evaluation data. So there's some questions around how do those youth and volunteers get trained in terms of understanding data management and protection. So all those pieces should be briefly, if not detailed, in your plan. Distribution we'll hold off on until I get to use and how participants will be protected. And again, that goes to the human subjects or human participants protocols. Just gonna, any questions or anything that
we do have some questions that we can read.
Okay, we're getting close. Okay. Thanks for holding those. We're almost at the end. Step 4, analyzing and interpreting. So you're going to need to describe in your plan how you are going to make sense of the data that you've got. Is your data qualitative, meaning descriptive? Is your data quantitative, meaning numerical? Is it a mixed method or combination? There are software packages. There are a variety of different tools available for both quantitative and qualitative. But in your plan, you're going to need to describe the processes and or tools or packages you're using for data analysis and interpretation. On the PD&E webpage, we've got a lot of resources around qualitative analysis. We're in the process of developing more around quantitative analysis and mixed methods. And we do have some publications also on our webpage on different ways to do data analysis. Real quick, some steps for analyzing data. This is really just what you need to describe or talk about briefly in your evaluation plan, in your proposal. We're not going to get into the implementation, but how is the data going to be organized? Again, what are the means by which the data will be analyzed? Who is going to be doing the interpretation? Is it the whole team? Is it just the evaluator? Are there others involved? Skip on the reflect. Using the information. So step 5, you're going to want to talk about in your plan how the results will be shared and used both by the team and distributed to appropriate stakeholders and audiences. You should connect this back to your engagement of stakeholders in the beginning. There are a lot of different ways to use information. I'll just read some of them. Annual reports, impact reports, oral presentations, photo displays, press releases, newsletters, bulletins, posters, elevator stories, media appearances. I mean, there's a really long list. I'm happy to talk with anybody about those, but really in the plan, what you need to do is most important, describe how use the analyzed data to share back out to stakeholders. Again, this is getting to the outcome and impact piece, and or if you're using it for your own project or program improvement, how that will happen. Data visualization, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but Stephanie Evergreen, some of you may know of her work. I really think she's probably got the best resources for data viz, and that's becoming increasingly popular for reporting, communicating impact stories, that sort of thing, and it's something to think about. I don't know that you necessarily need to describe that in your actual evaluation plan. This was more just, while we're on the topic, it might be useful for you to know. A couple of resources. So the program development and evaluation website, we're actually in the process of redesigning the website, but for now, on the front page of the website, you'll see a bunch of blue and green menu bars. There's one at the bottom of the page. So all the logic model tools are up at the top. At the bottom, there's a blue link that says quick tip guides. It's a bunch of evaluation publications. And then below that are more in-depth evaluation publications on all of the topics that I've talked about. We also have a bunch of resources around qualitative analysis. And as I mentioned, we're developing some more on quantitative analysis. Additionally, the UW River Falls Survey Research Center is a great resource if you're if survey design is part of your evaluation plan and strategy. I would recommend consulting with David Trechter or some of the team up there. And the UW Extension Environmental Resources Center also has evaluation services primarily focused on projects or efforts that are connected to natural resources and agriculture, but they're another great resource. These are just some references. I'm not going to hang out here too much. You can, when you get the PowerPoint, you can look at those, and we've got some time for questions now.
All right, our first question. Can you say more about how to identify pre and post internal collaborators?
How to identify? Sure. I think one of the first things that I would do is define the scope or parameter of the project. So if there's a geographic boundary on where your effort is taking place, I'd try to understand who's within that geographic boundary and who has been active and non-active around the particular issue. You can do that through looking at community groups. You can do that through looking at the population lab has a lot of great information around demographics, who's in certain geographies, or networks. You can look at network activity around a particular issue. People on the ground who have been involved. And I would also encourage you to look, most funders have a database of funded projects. So I would encourage you to look at who's already been working on that issue or within that particular area and who has or hasn't been engaged in that effort. Talking to local officials, heads of organizations, looking at media sources around, I mean, it's a little abstract because I don't know the full context, but I would spend some time sort of on that front end, sort of mapping, having your team map your understanding of the current situation or the current context in terms of who's been involved in the issue or opportunity. What do you think you know, and where are the gaps in your questions? And try to think about who might best be able to help you answer those questions. And also, I would encourage maybe thinking about perspectives that aren't at the table. So for example, youth are often overlooked in This is not true for my 4-H youth development colleagues out there on the line, but often youth might be overlooked in issues and activities that are going on in the broader adult space in a community or set of communities. So that might be a missing perspective, and you could think about engaging through schools or after schools or a variety of different mechanisms. Or there may be a new immigrant community within a larger community that's really been not involved, but has a stake in something that's going on. Thinking through how do you connect with those communities through social service programs, potentially faith organizations, activities that are going on in the community, grocery stores. I mean, there are a variety of different ways. I would say in terms of the post, what you might think about, I think that question is getting at who do you want to outreach to in terms of the work as it's going along or after it goes along. And I think having a communication function as part of a project makes a lot of sense, in that you've got a designated person or function that's really focused on that outreach aspect. And it could be through social media, it could be through regular media, it could be through sharing the results in public forums, thinking through who that needs to go to. I think if you're monitoring your project as you go, you get a feel for who's showing up and who's maybe not showing up that you want to reach out to.
So this question kind of goes along with that. And
okay.
Can you repeat the questions?
Oh, sure. Yep.
Yeah. You have recommendations on how to figure out who your stakeholders are.
Recommendations to figure out who your stakeholders are. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a hard one. I think this is probably where we don't spend enough time, which is really trying to understand the larger context in which the issue that our project proposal is being submitted for. And there's a tendency, I think, for the usual suspects, I think is the term, usual suspects to show up around particular issues. And so one of the things, again, I'm going to go back to, as a starting point, demographics can be really helpful, and understanding just getting a map almost of who is within the geography that you're trying to implement. You'll probably be surprised about who's there. And I think the Applied Population Lab is a great resource for that. There are other resources as well. And as you get a sense of who's in the community, really thinking about what do we actually know about each of those groups' perspectives on this particular issue. Not that that's a homogenous thing, but ask yourselves who from those different population groups has been involved that you're aware of, or showing up that you're involved in. I would really do some sort of needs assessment or baseline activity to really try to fill out your understanding of who's there and who has or hasn't been involved, and how they do or don't perceive their own stake in whatever the issue is. I would recommend that as really a core starting place. The other idea is to hold sort of informal, friendly, open meetings. It could be at a place that people typically are going, for example, a grocery store, a library, community center, senior center, where you may just have a sort of a public invitation, open house, or series of them, moving them around, and sharing or talking about what the project is about, garnering interest in that way from who shows up, and using that as an opportunity to kind of maybe do a little network mapping. So figuring out who's there and who they're connected to and who they're talking to. I think those are probably the two strategies I would start out with, and as part of sort of a baseline exercise.
All right, the logic model on slide 11. Can you say a bit more about satisfaction under inputs or outputs, sorry?
I'm gonna. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think a common limitation of, I'm not sure if I'm getting at your question here, but
the question is specifically about the satisfaction bit.
Right. Yep. Satisfaction is a pretty common metric that's used in evaluation instruments, and it's helpful in terms of evaluating whether somebody felt like they got something out of whatever you did. It's not a direct measure of change that resulted from whatever it was you're doing. I think if your primary goal for your effort is to create a satisfying experience, that would be an important measure. I think measurement of satisfaction is a pretty limited measure in terms of understanding actual effect of an activity, other than, so it's not a direct, I'm getting into direct and indirect, it's not a direct measure of, did I learn something? A direct measure of whether I've learned something or I understand something new, or I'm able to practice a new behavior or skill, is the actual demonstration of it, either through actually physically doing it or testing. So if you're trying to make a case that let's say you did a training and you want to make a case that led to an increase in knowledge, a satisfaction measure is not going to be sufficient. If the purpose of your evaluation is to understand if the experience was valued and whether people are likely to come back, measurement of satisfaction would be helpful, but probably not sufficient. I'm not sure if that person is able to, if there's sort of more to that question, feel free.
Feel free to email it again if they need more clarification.
Okay.
Yep. All right, one more question. Would you recommend deciding your micro impacts first, then your macro, or working backwards from what you want your macro impact to be?
That's a great question. This is a little lumper and... Oh, yes. So the question was, would I recommend starting identifying the macro level outcomes or the micro level outcomes? And that's a great question. I really think it's a little lumper and splitterish, meaning I think those both need to exist. And whether you and your team find it easier and more comfortable to start at the macro and then dissect that and say, well, what does that mean for our specific implementation activities, and how do they feed into that and work in service of that? That's totally fine. If how your team works is really thinking through each implementation and looking then across, where's the pattern, what's common, and building that up to a macro statement, that's fine too. I think the important point is that if your project has multiple activities, all of those activities that are working in service of the same kind of outcome need to be related to each other in terms of the evaluation. So if I've got 3 different kinds of activities, I've got a National Fellows Program, I've got a water school, and I have a national symposium. And all 3 of those activities are designed to build confidence in applying systems thinking to water research. I want to evaluate, does each one of those instances do that? And I also want to understand that across a variety of different efforts. And so it doesn't really matter, to answer the question more directly, it doesn't matter where you start, but you need to make sure that if you're working with multiple efforts and they're nested, that they're connected to each other. Okay.
Any questions? I have a very sort of nuts and bolts question.
Sure.
About making logic models. So I usually use Word
Sure.
to make them, and it can be a bit cumbersome. You know, there's formatting issues. I'm just wondering what have you found?
Yeah.
That works best for making things that are visually pleasing.
Yeah, that's great. Oh, okay. So the question was around the construction of logic models and what tools and formats are preferred. So our colleague here uses Word often to construct them, and many people use Word and or Excel. Lots of times those can be limiting if you're not doing a linear sequential kind of design. And so drawing programs or mapping software programs can allow for greater flexibility. There are a variety of mapping and drawing tools, and we're actually in the process of developing some software that will help construct that. It's not quite ready yet, but some people actually do pen and paper picture and not translating it into a graphic design program. Word and Excel limiting because of that sort of linear sequential kind of flow. We've got some tools on our website, but we're hoping to expand them more. So I guess what I would encourage is, if you're, looking for, recursive arrows that go back on each other, I'd look for some kind of drawing software, and I'm happy to talk with you afterwards about some specific ones that I know people are using. Yeah.
We have grantees that we're asking them to do evaluation, but they're not necessarily set up to be able to do some of these, more in-depth kinds of evaluation. We want to be able to give them some guidelines for doing just some better qualitative kinds of capturing that impact kind of information as well as the outcomes. So a lot of them will do your Likert surveys, et cetera. It's not really that useful for us because we aren't going to get whether satisfaction really takes it further. So do you have anything in your guidelines that really kind of helps some guidance in how to create provocative questions to be able to draw out of people?
Yes. So back to the website, on the bottom 2 links, the evaluation publications link that's got a bunch of different workbooks and tools. There are a lot of them that provide much more sort of easy to use, simple guidance. I've actually got the publications list here, which I can send down to you to take a look at. But, from questionnaire design, basic questionnaire design, to articulating evaluation questions, that actually brings up a good point that I would maybe would just say something briefly about. When we're talking about focus, back to the creating an evaluation plan for a grant proposal, and talking about evaluation questions, those are not questions that you would put on a survey or interview. Those are the questions that guide your investigation. How to actually craft a good question on an instrument like an interview protocol or a questionnaire. There are a bunch of resources in that list that I think would be really useful. the evaluation questions I was talking about earlier are really like sort of what's guiding the whole evaluation activity.
All right. That's it for my questions.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank Jennifer. This was really great.
Thank you.
We had a small change for next month's coffee break. The speaker is no longer able to join us, so I'm working with somebody from the DNR that works in their grants office, and hopefully we will get her to speak to us about opportunities that are available through the DNR. So stay tuned. All right, thank you, everybody.